I stepped outside for my morning coffee and found a bulldozer eyeing my home like it was selecting its next meal. Behind it stood the HOA president, grinning like a power-drunk dictator with a clipboard crown. Before I could process, what the hell is happening? My grandfather's handcrafted cabin, built with love and decades of memories, was being turned into splinters for community enhancement. No warning, no discussion, just pure HOA tyranny. When the destruction ended, she slapped me with a fine and ordered me to clean up my own demolished house. Ever had your entire world destroyed before your first cup of coffee? Drop a comment if your HOA has ever pulled something this insane. Or if you're here for the drama, spoiler alert, it gets absolutely wild. Like, did this woman really just commit this level of stupidity? Let's dive into HOA nightmare stories. I had been calling my grandfather's cabin home for 2 years, ever since he passed and willed it to me. Life was beautifully simple. Rise with the dawn, brew coffee on the vintage stove, relax on the porch overlooking the shimmering lake. The cabin dated back to 1955, featuring solid oak beams and hand-carved details that modern construction never replicates. My grandfather, Edward Roberts, had constructed it himself as a young man, back when this entire region was untamed wilderness and gravel paths. As a freelance graphic designer, the serene lakefront lifestyle perfectly suited my needs. No nosy neighbors invading my space, no urban chaos, just gentle waves lapping the shoreline and morning birdsong as my soundtrack. That fateful morning began like countless others. I rolled from bed around 6:45, shuffled to the kitchen in my Superman sleep pants, and activated the coffee maker. Dawn was breaking over the lake, bathing everything in warm, golden pink hues. I grabbed my cherished mug, a cracked ceramic piece reading, "World's Greatest Grandpa," and was preparing to step onto the porch when I detected it. A deep, mechanical growling that absolutely didn't belong in my tranquil lakeside sanctuary. Initially, I assumed someone was doing construction down the road, but the sound was approaching and intensifying. I opened the front door and nearly dropped my coffee. There, approximately 50 feet from my cabin, sat a massive yellow bulldozer, its diesel engine rumbling like an enraged beast. The machine faced my home, its steel arm raised like it was preparing to attack. Behind it stood a woman I'd noticed around the neighborhood but never actually spoken with. She wore what appeared to be a discount professional suit, clutching a clipboard like it contained the Ten Commandments. Her blonde hair was styled in that aggressive manner some women adopt when trying to project authority. She possessed the kind of artificial smile that instantly made my skin crawl. "Excuse me," I called, jogging toward her in my pajamas and bare feet. "What's happening here?" "That's my house you're aiming that thing at." The woman turned to me with that same plastic grin, her eyes scanning me from head to toe like she was collecting evidence for a legal proceeding. "Oh, you must be the resident," she said in a voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm Charlotte Maxwell, president of the Lakeview Homeowners Association. We're conducting an emergency beautification project to enhance community standards." She gestured toward my cabin like it was some kind of eyesore. "This structure violates multiple aesthetic guidelines and must be removed to accommodate our new lakeside walking trail." I stood there momentarily, coffee mug in hand, trying to comprehend what she just declared. "Wait, hold on. You can't just demolish my house. I live here. This is private property." Charlotte's smile never faltered, but something icy flickered behind her eyes. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. According to HOA regulations, any structure that detracts from community standards can be removed after proper notification." She held up a single document. "This is your official notice. The demolition is scheduled for, well, now." Before I could respond, before I could even formulate what to say, the bulldozer roared to life. The operator, a stocky guy in a hard hat who wouldn't make eye contact, swung the machine's arm toward my cabin. "No, wait!" I shouted, but it was too late. The metal claw bit into the front porch, sending wood fragments flying through the air. The sound was horrific, like the building was screaming. 70 years of history, 2 years of memories, gone. I stared at the wreckage and heard my grandfather's voice from long ago. "One day this land will matter." I thought he meant it spiritually. He didn't. I watched in stunned silence as they dismantled my grandfather's craftsmanship. The hand-carved railings he'd spent weeks perfecting, the stone fireplace where we'd roasted marshmallows when I was a child, the little bedroom where I'd been sleeping just hours earlier. All of it vanished into a growing pile of debris. My cat Whiskers came racing out of the destruction, probably traumatized for life. Charlotte stood there the entire time, taking notes on her clipboard and occasionally shouting instructions to the demolition crew like she was directing a film. When it was finished, when my home had been reduced to nothing but broken timber and shattered dreams, Charlotte approached and handed me a stack of papers. "You have 24 hours to clean up this mess," she said, her voice now stripped of all pretense of politeness. "And there's a $3,000 fine for violating community standards, plus cleanup fees. Welcome to organized community living, sweetie." Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there in my Superman pajamas, holding a broken coffee mug and wondering what the hell had just happened to my life. I spent the remainder of that day sitting in my pickup truck, staring at the pile of rubble that used to be my home. Every piece of broken wood felt like a knife in my chest. The cabin wasn't just where I lived. It was the last connection I had to my grandfather, the only family I'd ever really known. Now it was gone, destroyed by some power-hungry woman with a clipboard and a god complex. I had nowhere to go, no backup plan, and apparently owed thousands of dollars in fees I'd never agreed to pay. The first thing I did was start knocking on doors, trying to figure out who this Charlotte Maxwell was and how she'd gotten the authority to demolish someone's house. Most of my neighbors were friendly enough, but they all had the same reaction when I mentioned Charlotte's name. A kind of fearful respect that made me uneasy. "Oh, you don't want to mess with her," said Mrs. Peterson from down the road. "She's turned this HOA into her personal kingdom since she moved here." Another neighbor, Bob something or other, just shook his head sadly. "She got the Johnsons too, made them tear down their gazebo, said it wasn't architecturally consistent with the neighborhood. It was Anna Williams who finally gave me the complete picture. Anna was a retired librarian in her 60s, a woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for 25 years and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that came from dealing with difficult people all her life. She invited me into her kitchen, poured me a cup of coffee, and told me exactly what I was dealing with. Charlotte moved in, fined someone for having a yellow door in week 2. Month 2, she rewrote the bylaws. "Now she acts like Queen of Lakeview," Anna said, stirring her coffee with angry precision. The woman was a predator who'd identified vulnerable targets and struck without mercy. Anna leaned back in her chair and studied me with knowing eyes. "You want to know what I think? I think she's trying to turn this place into some kind of upscale lakefront community to boost property values. Your grandfather's cabin was just in the way of her grand vision." The more Anna talked, the angrier I got. Charlotte wasn't just some bureaucrat drunk on power. She was systematically destroying the neighborhood's character to feed her own ego. "She did the same thing to the Hendersons last month," Anna continued. "Made them remove their deck because it was too rustic for the new community standards. They're talking about moving." I asked Anna about Charlotte's background, and what she told me made everything click into place. Word is she went through a nasty divorce about a year ago. Lost the big house, lost the fancy lifestyle, had to start over. I think she sees this HOA as her chance to build a little empire where she gets to be queen. It made sense in a twisted way. Charlotte was a person who'd lost control over her own life, so she was trying to control everyone else's instead. The HOA wasn't about community improvement. It was about feeding her damaged ego. By the time I left Anna's house, I had a plan. I drove straight to Charlotte's address, which turned out to be a modest ranch house with a detached garage. The garage had been converted into what Charlotte probably called her HOA office, complete with a hand-painted sign that read, Lakeview Community Association Administrative Center. It was laughably pretentious. Folding tables, cheap office chairs, and fresh paint couldn't hide that it was still just a garage. Charlotte was sitting behind a card table covered with manila folders, wearing the same discount business suit from that morning. "Mr.," she began, looking up from her paperwork with raised eyebrows. "Roberts. Mark Roberts, and we need to talk about what you did to my house." Charlotte's expression didn't change, but I could see her mentally shifting into defensive mode. "I explained the situation this morning, Mr. Roberts. Your structure was in violation of community standards and had to be removed. It's all perfectly legal and within the HOA's authority. She gestured to a binder full of papers. Everything is documented according to proper procedures. I spent the next 30 minutes arguing with her, trying to get some kind of reasonable explanation for why my house had been demolished without warning. Charlotte was smooth, I'll give her that. She had an answer for everything, all delivered in that same condescending tone she'd used that morning. According to her, the cabin was an aesthetic blight that lowered property values for everyone in the community. The demolition was an emergency action to prevent further deterioration of neighborhood standards. The fees were necessary to cover administrative costs and community improvement initiatives. But as I sat there in her makeshift office, surrounded by cheap furniture and amateur attempts at authority, I started to see through her act. Charlotte Maxwell wasn't some all-powerful community leader. She was a woman playing dress-up in a garage, trying to convince herself and everyone else that she was important. The realization didn't make me any less angry, but it did give me hope. If Charlotte was just another bully hiding behind official-sounding paperwork, then maybe she could be beaten at her own game. The meeting ended with Charlotte handing me another stack of papers. $5,000 total, she said, back to that fake sweet voice. $3,000 for the violation fine, $2,000 for cleanup and disposal costs. You have 48 hours to pay, or we'll be forced to pursue legal action. She stood up, smoothing down her suit jacket. I do hope you'll choose to be cooperative, Mr. Roberts. It would be such a shame if this had to get complicated. As I walked back to my truck, Anna Williams appeared at her fence. How did it go? She asked, though she could probably tell from my expression. About as well as you'd expect, I replied. She wants $5,000 and acts like she's doing me a favor by not charging more. Anna nodded grimly, then glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Mark, there's something I need to show you. Something your grandfather left behind. He told me if anyone ever messed with that cabin, I should give it to you. I think now might be the time. Anna led me down into her basement, past shelves lined with decades of accumulated memories and forgotten household items. In the far corner, behind an old washer and dryer, she pulled out a wooden box that looked like it had been crafted in the same era as my grandfather's cabin. The wood was dark with age and the brass hinges had turned green with oxidation. Your grandfather gave this to me about 5 years ago, Anna explained as she set the box on her workbench. He said, if anyone ever tried to take the cabin or mess with the property, I should give this to you. He was very specific about that. I'd never seen the box before, which wasn't entirely surprising. My grandfather had been a private man, someone who kept important things close to his chest. He'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. But even after all those years together, there were parts of his life that remained mysterious. He'd been a carpenter by trade, but he'd also been remarkably well organized and methodical about documentation. Every receipt, every warranty, every piece of paperwork related to the cabin had been carefully filed away in his study. Anna lifted the lid, revealing a collection of documents that looked official and important. The papers were yellowed with age but carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. On top was a land survey map that showed not just my grandfather's property, but the entire lakefront area. As I studied the map, my heart started beating faster. According to the survey, my grandfather hadn't just owned the lot where the cabin sat. He'd owned a 200-foot strip of lakefront property that extended well beyond what I thought was mine. I don't understand, I said, pointing to the map. This shows Grandpa owning half the shoreline. I thought he just had the cabin and maybe an acre around it. Anna smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Your grandfather was a smart man, Mark. Back in 1965, when he bought this land, it was all one big parcel. He subdivided it himself, sold off the individual lots to create the neighborhood, but he kept the lakefront for the family. He always said the Roberts family would need it someday. Turns out the lake, the beach, even Charlotte's precious clubhouse all sat on land my grandfather quietly kept, and now it was mine. According to a survey from 1968, the land where the HOA clubhouse currently sat was part of my grandfather's original property. Charlotte Maxwell hadn't just demolished my house, she'd done it on my own land. And her precious clubhouse, the headquarters of her little empire, was also sitting on property that belonged to me. Anna, Are you seeing this? I asked, my voice shaking as I held up the property deed. The clubhouse, Charlotte's office. It's all on my land. She doesn't own any of this. Anna nodded, her expression grim but satisfied. I was wondering when you'd figure that out. Your grandfather mentioned it a few times over the years. He always said if the community ever got too big for its britches, the Roberts family had options. The full implications of what I was looking at hit me like a freight train. Charlotte had bulldozed my life on my land. Her whole empire built on my property without asking. I wasn't just the victim of HOA overreach. I was a landowner who'd been having his property illegally occupied for years without even knowing it. The woman who'd been treating me like a powerless tenant was actually the one who was trespassing. I spent the next hour going through every document in the box, cross-referencing property lines and ownership records. Anna helped, sharing stories about my grandfather that I'd never heard before. Apparently, he'd been quite the strategic thinker, always planning several moves ahead. He used to say that people would try to take advantage of the family someday, Anna recalled. He wanted to make sure you'd have the tools to fight back when that day came. By the time I finished reviewing everything, I had a complete picture of my actual property holdings. I owned not just the cabin site, but the entire shoreline where people launched their boats, the beach area where kids played during the summer, and yes, the land where the clubhouse sat. According to the easement agreements, the community had been granted access to these areas for recreational use, but that access was contingent on the property owner's approval. Charlotte had been operating under the assumption that these were common areas owned by the HOA, but she was wrong, dead wrong. I thanked Anna and headed back to my truck, my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since that morning, I felt something other than helpless anger. I felt powerful. Charlotte Maxwell had picked a fight with the wrong person, and she didn't even know it yet. I drove straight to the clubhouse, parked right in front of the main entrance, and walked up to the building like I owned the place, which as it turned out, I did. Charlotte was inside conducting what looked like an impromptu meeting with several other HOA board members. Through the windows, I could see her gesturing dramatically, while a small audience nodded along with whatever she was saying. I knocked on the door and waited. When Charlotte opened it, her expression immediately shifted from confident to irritated. Mr. Roberts, this is a private HOA meeting. Unless you're here to discuss your payment arrangements, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I smiled at her, probably the first genuine smile I'd managed all day. Actually, Charlotte, I think we need to talk about payment arrangements, but not the kind you're thinking of. I held up the property survey, making sure she could see the official seals and stamps that validated it. Nice building you have here. It's a shame it's sitting on my land without my permission. I think it's time we discussed rent. The look on Charlotte's face when I showed her the property documents was worth every miserable moment I'd endured that day. Her fake confidence cracked like ice on a pond, and for just a second I saw the insecure, desperate woman hiding behind all that manufactured authority. She quickly recovered, of course, snatching the papers from my hands and studying them with the intensity of someone looking for any possible flaw or loophole. These could be forgeries, she said finally, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Anyone can create fake documents these days. The other board members, 3 middle-aged residents I'd seen around but never really met, crowded around to look at the survey. One of them, a thin man with nervous energy who introduced himself as Adam Bradley, kept glancing between the papers and Charlotte like he was watching a tennis match. Are these legitimate? He asked, directing the question to me, but clearly hoping Charlotte would answer instead. They look pretty official to me, I replied, enjoying the way Charlotte's jaw tightened with each word I spoke. Signed, sealed, and filed with the county clerk's office back in 1965. Charlotte tried to regain control of the situation by calling an emergency community meeting for that evening. She needed to get ahead of this story before it spread through the neighborhood and undermined her authority. I could see the calculation behind her eyes. If she could frame me as a troublemaker trying to destroy the community with frivolous legal claims, she might be able to salvage her position. It was actually a smart move, which made me respect her intelligence even as I despised everything else about her. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, which added a delicious layer of irony to the entire situation. Charlotte had set up folding chairs in neat rows, hung an American flag behind her podium, and even prepared a PowerPoint presentation on a borrowed projector. She'd clearly spent the afternoon researching property law and community regulations, trying to find any angle that would invalidate my claims. When I walked in, she greeted me with that fake smile again. "So glad you could join us, Mr. Roberts. I think it's important for the community to hear both sides of this situation." About 30 residents showed up, which was apparently a good turnout for a neighborhood meeting. Charlotte began with a presentation about community values and the importance of maintaining standards. She painted a picture of a harmonious lakefront community threatened by outside forces who didn't understand or respect their way of life. Then she introduced me as someone who was trying to use questionable legal documents to disrupt their peaceful existence and potentially deny them access to amenities they'd enjoyed for decades. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I stood up, held up the property survey, and said, "My grandfather owned this land. I inherited it from him. According to these documents, which are on file with the county, I own the shoreline and the land this building sits on. Miss Maxwell demolished my house this morning without my permission on my property to build a walking path on land that belongs to me. I'm not trying to hurt anyone or take anything away from the community. I just want what's rightfully mine. Some backed me, some feared me, some hated me, but they were listening." Charlotte let the chaos continue for a few minutes, then called for order and began her counterattack. "What Mr. Roberts is proposing," she said in her most authoritative voice, "would be devastating to our community. If he's allowed to make these claims, he could block access to the lake, shut down community events, even demand that we tear down the clubhouse. Is that really the kind of neighbor we want?" She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "I've spent months working to improve property values and community standards. Are we going to let one person's greed destroy everything we've built together?" But Charlotte made one crucial mistake that night. In her eagerness to discredit me, she overplayed her hand. "Mr. Roberts claims to own property that has been part of this community for decades," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward the windows that overlooked the lake. "But ownership means responsibility. If he truly owned this land, why has he been letting the HOA maintain it, improve it, and pay for its upkeep? Where has he been while we've been working to make this neighborhood a better place for everyone?" It was a good rhetorical point, but it also gave me the opening I needed. I stood up slowly, letting the room fall quiet before I spoke. "You want to know where I've been, Charlotte? I've been living quietly in my grandfather's cabin, respecting my neighbors and not bothering anyone. I didn't know I owned all this land because my grandfather never told me. He kept it simple, left me the cabin, and trusted that I'd figure out the rest when I needed to. Well, now I need to." I walked to the front of the room and faced the audience directly. "I don't want to shut down community access to the lake. I don't want to tear down the clubhouse, but I also don't want to be bulldozed by someone who thinks a clipboard and a bad attitude give her the right to destroy other people's property." I looked directly at Charlotte. "I don't need my cabin back, Charlotte. I just need you to start paying rent for the clubhouse you built on my land." The room exploded into arguments and heated discussions that lasted well past Charlotte's planned adjournment time. People were taking sides, forming alliances, and generally behaving like the democracy Charlotte claimed to represent. It was messy and chaotic and absolutely beautiful to watch. As I left the meeting, I heard Adam Bradley whispering urgently to Charlotte about Plan B and the nuclear option. Whatever they were planning, I had a feeling things were about to get much more interesting. The next morning, Anna Williams knocked on my truck window at 7 a.m. sharp. I'd spent the night in the cab of my pickup, parked in what used to be my driveway, partly because I had nowhere else to go, and partly because I wanted to keep an eye on my property. Anna was carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd made an important decision. "There's more," she said without preamble, "about your grandfather's land. Something I didn't tell you yesterday because I wasn't sure you were ready for it." I followed her back to her kitchen, where she'd laid out additional documents that hadn't been in the original box. These papers were even older, dating back to the original land purchase in 1965. As Anna explained it, my grandfather hadn't just bought the lakefront property. He'd been the developer who'd created the entire subdivision. "Edward Roberts Development Company," she said, pointing to a faded business license. "Your grandfather bought 200 acres of undeveloped land and turned it into the neighborhood we have today. Everything lined up. My name, my land, her mistake. He'd retained ownership of all the critical infrastructure, the shoreline, the beach access, the boat launch, even the small island about 50 yards offshore where kids like to swim in the summer. Everything that made this a desirable lakefront community was still technically Robert's family property. The individual homeowners owned their houses and lots, but all the amenities that defined their lifestyle belonged to me. But why didn't he ever tell me any of this? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what I'd inherited. Anna smiled sadly. He planned to when you were older and ready to handle the responsibility. But then he got sick, and things happened faster than anyone expected. I think he figured you'd discover it naturally when the time was right. She paused, studying my face. Turns out he was correct about that. Anna spread out a modern aerial photograph of the neighborhood next to my grandfather's original development plans. The comparison was striking. Almost everything had been built exactly where he'd envisioned it, including roads that curved around protected tree groves and drainage systems that still functioned perfectly after 60 years. Your grandfather wasn't just a carpenter, Mark. He was a visionary who understood how communities work. He planned this whole place from the ground up. As we talked, I began to understand the true scope of Charlotte's miscalculation. She hadn't just demolished my cabin. She'd declared war on the person who essentially owned the foundation of her entire power structure. The clubhouse, the beach, the boat launch, the walking path she was so eager to expand, all of it existed at my discretion. I wasn't just another resident she could bully into compliance. I was, for all practical purposes, the landlord of the entire community. The implications were staggering. If I wanted to, I could revoke the community's access to the lake entirely. I could demand rent from the HOA for using my land. I could even shut down the clubhouse and force Charlotte to find somewhere else to hold her meetings. The power dynamic between us hadn't just shifted, it had completely reversed. Charlotte had spent months terrorizing residents with threats about community standards and HOA authority, never realizing she was operating entirely at the pleasure of someone she'd just made into an enemy. I spent the rest of the morning walking around the neighborhood, seeing it with completely new eyes. Every dock, every walking path, every community improvement Charlotte had implemented was built on land that belonged to me. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman who destroyed my home to build her lakeside walking path had actually been working on my property the entire time. She'd been so focused on creating her vision of an upscale lakefront community that she'd never bothered to check who actually owned the lakefront. By afternoon, word had spread through the neighborhood about my property claims. Supporters, skeptics, and haters, they all came, but no one could ignore me now. Charlotte's response was predictably aggressive. She spent the day making phone calls and researching legal challenges to my ownership claims. By evening, she'd organized what she called a community defense strategy meeting, essentially a rally designed to unite the neighborhood against me. The meeting was held in the park pavilion instead of the clubhouse, probably because Charlotte was beginning to realize the awkwardness of holding anti-Mark meetings in a building that might actually belong to Mark. About 40 people showed up, which was a bigger crowd than the previous night. Charlotte had prepared even more extensively this time, with legal citations and precedent cases that she claimed would invalidate my property rights. But her presentation revealed just how desperate she was becoming. She rambled law like a desperate actress reading Latin. She mentioned eminent domain as a potential tool for seizing critical infrastructure. She even suggested that my grandfather's original development activities might have created legal obligations that transferred ownership to the community. It was all legally questionable and practically impossible, but it served Charlotte's purpose of making the audience feel like they had options other than dealing with me reasonably. I waited until she finished her presentation before I stood up to respond. The crowd was clearly divided. Some people seemed convinced by Charlotte's arguments, while others looked skeptical about her increasingly extreme proposals. Charlotte's given you a lot of legal theories tonight, I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. But here's the simple truth. I own this land, and I have the documents to prove it. You can try to challenge that in court if you want, but it's going to cost a lot of money and take years to resolve. I looked around the pavilion, making eye contact with as many residents as possible. What I'm offering is much simpler. I want fair compensation for the cabin you destroyed, and I want a reasonable rental agreement for the community's use of my property. I'm not trying to shut down anyone's access to the lake or destroy the neighborhood. I just want to be treated with the same respect you'd want if someone bulldozed your house. The meeting devolved into heated arguments between different factions of residents. Some wanted to negotiate with me immediately, others insisted on fighting my claims in court, and a few suggested trying to buy the disputed land outright. Charlotte tried to maintain control, but her authority was clearly cracking under the pressure of a situation she couldn't bully her way out of. As people filtered out of the pavilion, I heard Adam Bradley telling her that they needed to escalate this before it gets completely out of hand. That night, as I settled into my truck for another uncomfortable night of sleeping in the cab, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of knowing I held all the cards in a high-stakes game. Charlotte Maxwell had spent months making herself the most powerful person in the neighborhood, but she'd built her empire on land that didn't belong to her. Tomorrow I was going to start collecting rent. Charlotte's escalation began at 6 a.m. the next morning when I woke up to find my truck covered in spray paint and the remnants of my demolished cabin scattered across the road. Someone had also left a dead fish on my windshield with a note that read, "Get out," in block letters. It was juvenile and obvious, exactly the kind of intimidation tactic I'd expect from someone who was used to bullying people into submission, but had never dealt with anyone who could fight back effectively. I took pictures of everything, documenting the vandalism carefully before cleaning it up. If Charlotte wanted to play dirty, she was going to discover that I was much better at keeping records than she was. While I worked, several neighbors stopped by to apologize and distance themselves from whoever had done this. Mrs. Peterson even brought me a thermos of coffee and offered to let me use her shower until I figured out my housing situation. The support was nice, but I could also sense the underlying tension. People were choosing sides, and the community Charlotte claimed to represent was fracturing along lines she couldn't control. By noon, Charlotte had filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office, claiming that I was trespassing on community property and threatening residents with frivolous legal action. She'd also contacted a lawyer, apparently the cheapest one she could find based on the quality of the threatening letter that was delivered to me that afternoon. The letter demanded that I cease making false ownership claims and warned of potential criminal charges if I continued to harass community members with my fraudulent documents. The legal threat was laughably weak, full of vague language and misstatements of property law that any competent attorney would have caught. But it served Charlotte's real purpose, which was to make me look like a dangerous troublemaker who was being investigated by law enforcement. She made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew about her complaint, painting herself as a brave community leader, standing up to a potentially violent individual who was trying to steal their lake access. What Charlotte didn't count on was that the sheriff's deputy who came to investigate turned out to be someone who actually understood property law. Deputy Martinez took one look at my grandfather's survey documents, cross-referenced them with the county records, and confirmed that my ownership claims were legitimate. "Ma'am," he told Charlotte when she insisted on being present during his investigation, "this gentleman owns this land, has owned it for decades. You can't file trespassing complaints against someone for being on their own property." Charlotte's response to this setback was to double down on her legal strategy. She hired a second lawyer, apparently willing to spend serious money now that her authority was genuinely threatened, and filed a lawsuit challenging the validity of my grandfather's original property deeds. The lawsuit claimed that my documents were forgeries, that the original land sales had been conducted improperly, and that decades of community use had established permanent rights that superseded individual ownership claims. It was a desperate move that revealed just how cornered Charlotte felt, but it was also potentially effective. The lawsuit wouldn't win, but it could stall everything for months. During that time, she could continue operating as if nothing had changed, maintaining her control over the HOA and community amenities while I spent my savings on legal fees. It was a calculated gamble that showed Charlotte was a much more dangerous opponent than I had initially realized. But Charlotte made one critical error in her rush to destroy me legally. In her lawsuit, she claimed that I'd never had proper legal authority to restrict community access to the disputed land because I'd failed to provide appropriate notification of my ownership claims. To support this argument, she submitted an affidavit stating that she'd conducted proper due diligence before authorizing the demolition of my cabin and had found no evidence of conflicting ownership claims. The problem with Charlotte's affidavit was that it contradicted her own earlier statements about following proper HOA procedures. If she'd really conducted due diligence before demolishing my cabin, she would have been required to file for a demolition permit with the county. If she'd filed for a permit, she would have been required to provide advance notice to the property owner, me. The fact that she'd done neither of these things meant she'd either lied in her affidavit or committed illegal destruction of property. Either way, she just handed me the evidence I needed to destroy her. I spent that evening in Anna's kitchen, going through every document related to the cabin demolition. Anna had been keeping her own records, including photographs of the demolition crew and notes about the timeline of events. Together, we built a comprehensive case showing that Charlotte had acted completely outside her legal authority when she ordered my cabin destroyed. She hadn't obtained permits, hadn't provided notice, and hadn't followed any of the procedures required by county law for demolishing structures. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and filed my own lawsuit against Charlotte Maxwell and the Lakeview Homeowners Association. Unlike Charlotte's desperate legal fishing expedition, my case was straightforward. Illegal destruction of property, violation of due process rights, and abuse of authority. I also filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office about Charlotte's misuse of HOA funds to pay for unauthorized demolition and legal fees. Within hours of my filing, the story had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Charlotte had spent weeks telling residents that she was protecting them from my legal threats, but now she was the one facing serious civil and potentially criminal liability. Several residents who supported her began distancing themselves, worried about being associated with someone who might have committed actual crimes. The community Charlotte had worked so hard to unite against me was beginning to fracture in ways she couldn't control. That evening, as I sat in my truck reviewing the day's legal developments, Adam Bradley approached my window. He looked nervous, constantly glancing around to make sure no one was watching our conversation. "Look, Mark," he said in a low voice, "maybe we can work something out. Charlotte doesn't have to know. How much would it take for you to just disappear, take your land claims, and move somewhere else?" It was exactly the kind of offer I'd been expecting. Adam was clearly Charlotte's designated intermediary, authorized to negotiate a settlement that would preserve her authority while making me go away. The fact that he was operating in secret meant Charlotte was finally beginning to understand how much trouble she was really in. But Adam's offer also revealed something important. They were running scared, and scared people make mistakes. I smiled at Adam through my truck window, enjoying the moment of power reversal. "That's an interesting offer, Adam, but I think I'll stick around and see how this plays out. Your boss picked this fight, and now she gets to finish it." The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October, exactly 3 months after Charlotte Maxwell had demolished my cabin. The county courthouse was an imposing brick building that had been dispensing justice for over a century, and walking into it felt like entering a final showdown. Charlotte arrived with her lawyer, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who kept shuffling through papers like he was looking for something he'd lost. She was dressed in her most professional outfit, a navy blue dress that was probably the most expensive thing she owned, and carried herself with the kind of forced confidence that comes from knowing you're in serious trouble. I had chosen to represent myself, partly to save money, but mostly because my case was so straightforward that I didn't need legal expertise to present it. The facts were simple. Charlotte had destroyed my property without legal authority on land that belonged to me while violating multiple county ordinances and state laws. Her own affidavit in the lawsuit she'd filed against me provided evidence of her misconduct. Sometimes the truth really is simple enough that it doesn't need a lawyer to explain it. Judge Henderson was a facts-first type. Charlotte's lawyer flailed. I didn't need to say much. The truth spoke loud. When it was my turn to present, I kept it simple. I showed the judge my grandfather's original property deeds, the county survey maps, and the tax records proving continuous ownership for 60 years. Then I showed her the photographs of my demolished cabin in the complete absence of any demolition, permits, or advance notices that Charlotte should have obtained before destroying someone's house. Your Honor, I said, the defendant demolished my home without permission, without permits, and without legal authority. She did this on my property to build amenities for an organization that was using my land without authorization. The turning point came when Judge Henderson asked Charlotte directly about her demolition procedures. Ms. Maxwell, can you show the court the demolition permit you obtained before ordering Mr. Roberts' cabin destroyed? Charlotte's lawyer immediately objected, claiming the question was irrelevant to the property ownership dispute, but the judge overruled him. The permit, Miss Maxwell, I'd like to see it. Charlotte sat silent for several long seconds, her face growing redder by the moment. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. There was no permit, Your Honor. It was an emergency action to maintain community standards. Judge Henderson raised her eyebrows. An emergency that required you to demolish someone's house without notice? Can you explain what kind of emergency would justify that level of action? That's when Charlotte made the mistake that sealed her fate. Instead of admitting error or trying to minimize her actions, she doubled down on her authority as HOA president. That cabin was a blight on the community, she said, her voice rising with indignation. It was bringing down property values for everyone. As elected president of the Homeowners Association, I had the authority to take action for the good of the community. Judge Henderson leaned forward in her chair, studying Charlotte with the kind of intense focus that comes before a judicial ruling that will be remembered for years. Ms. Maxwell, are you telling this court that you believe HOA authority supersedes county building codes, state property laws, and constitutional due process rights? Charlotte's lawyer tried to interrupt, but she was beyond his control now. I was protecting the community, she declared. Someone had to take action. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Charlotte Maxwell was liable for illegal destruction of property and would pay $95,000 in damages to cover the full replacement cost of my cabin, plus interest and legal fees. The Lakeview Homeowners Association was dissolved immediately for irregular practices and unauthorized use of member funds. Charlotte was also required to issue a written public apology to me and to every resident who had been affected by her abuse of authority, but Judge Henderson wasn't finished. Ms. Maxwell, your actions in this case represent a serious abuse of authority that caused significant harm to Mr. Roberts and potentially to other community members. I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution related to destruction of property and misuse of position. The courtroom was silent as the implications of the judge's words sank in. Charlotte's face had gone from red to pale white, and she seemed to shrink into her chair as the reality of her situation became clear. She wasn't just losing a civil lawsuit. She was facing potential criminal charges that could result in jail time and permanent damage to her reputation. As we left the courthouse, Charlotte made one final attempt at damage control. She approached me in the parking lot, her lawyer trailing behind and frantically trying to stop her from saying anything that could be used against her later. This isn't over, she said, though her voice lacked any conviction. I'll appeal this decision. I'll prove you forged those documents. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had destroyed my home and tried to ruin my life because she needed to feel powerful. Charlotte, I said quietly, it's been over since the moment you decided to demolish my cabin. You just took 3 months to figure that out. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of my new cabin, watching the sunrise over the lake and sipping coffee from the same chipped mug that had survived Charlotte's demolition. The new cabin was bigger than my grandfather's original, with a guest room where Anna Williams often stayed when she wanted to escape her own house for a few days. I'd also built a small community dock where neighbors could launch their boats and a picnic area where families gathered for weekend barbecues. The Lakeview community was thriving without Charlotte's iron-fisted management. Property values had actually increased after the HOA was dissolved, partly because people enjoyed living in a neighborhood where they didn't have to fear arbitrary rules and punitive fines. Charlotte herself had been forced to sell her house to pay the judgment against her and had moved to another state to avoid the ongoing criminal investigation. As I sat there enjoying the peaceful morning, my phone rang. The caller identified himself as an attorney representing residents of another lakefront community about 50 miles away. Mr. Roberts, he said, we have a situation with an HOA president who's been demolishing residents' property without authorization. We were wondering if you might be willing to share your experience and possibly assist with our case. I looked out at the lake, remembering my grandfather's words about protecting the land and the family. I think I can help with that, I said. When do you need me? Some battles are worth fighting, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Charlotte Maxwell had taught me that bullies only understand one language, the language of consequences, and I was apparently becoming fluent in that particular dialect. If you enjoyed watching justice served and a bully get exactly what she deserved, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more satisfying stories of karma in action. And let me know in the comments what you think Charlotte's biggest mistake was. I love hearing your thoughts on these kinds of community conflicts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching HOA Unleashed. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.